Hello and welcome to our 17th live stream on Ancient Egypt and the Bible here. And we are back at our regular time, and it's great to be here. In case you guys didn't figure it out, 17 is a prime number. So that's why we named it back to prime time. So we're little bit of a mathematics pun there. So the format is the same as it is every week. We take your questions on Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Super chats have priority. No one should be surprised with that. We will take as many non-super chats as we can, and if you do a non-super chat, please prefix your question with a Q and a colon, so I know it's directed to me instead of others inside the chat. And also, I also would ask that you only mention your question once so I can know whether or not I have addressed it. Okay? So tonight, it doesn't look like we have any super chats to begin with, so we'll just get into questions. So let's see here. Only one so far. So disciple of Christ. Let's see here. It's a little bigger so I can read it. Did the Egyptians have a rich music culture? They did have a rich music culture, yeah. What were their preferred instruments? Okay, they played flute, which they made from papyrus reeds. They had cymbals, small handheld cymbals, finger cymbals to be exact. They had sistrum, which was kind of a rattle. It's a rattle, probably the most important musical instrument as far as its religious symbolism. You see the sistrum being used in a lot of temple scenes. So and yes, music was very, very important in temple ritual as well. The other one is a lyre. Now, the lyres that the Egyptians used were big instruments. They were more like a harp than say a handheld lyre like the Greeks used. So they're full-sized harp-sized instruments. So there are several scenes and tombs of musicians playing and dancers. So actually, yeah, it was very, very important to the Egyptian culture. Now, with that said, we don't know how if they even if they did record music in say a notation. It looks a lot like it was sort of passed down orally from musician to musician. But it is very interesting to see that all these instruments being played. So they had an ensemble, and an ensemble that was capable of producing some interesting kinds of music. So anyway, thank you very much for your question. Very much appreciated. Okay. Okay, I'm going to take White Girl with Instagram Black Screams question here. I'm very interested if you have a theory on who you think the historical Nimrod was. Okay. I don't actually have an opinion on this yet because I haven't really looked at it in detail. Sayce in the 19th century thought it was Sargon of Akkad. Now, he's one possibility, but I think there's other possibilities too, like Naram Sim. There's a variety of potential candidates for Nimrod. So until I really start looking at this a little deeper, I'm not going to give an affirmative opinion on this yet. So I know I have to go back and look at this issue, but I just haven't gotten there yet. I've been kind of busy. And I should mention one of the things I've had in the last 2 months is I've just been deluged with publication deadlines. So I've had to sort of I'm still sort of catching my breath from this, and I'm still not through it. So once I get sort of past those publication deadlines, I might have a little bit of time to start looking at some of these other issues too. So right now, I don't have an opinion on this, but I think there's lots of candidates who could fit the bill. So thank you very much for your question. Okay, we've got our first super chat here from Matthew Harrell for $5. Thank you very much. What are the Urim and Thummim, and where did the candelabra in the temple come from? Okay. The candelabra is a piece of furniture that goes way back. We don't know exactly why the candelabra was designed, but it is part of the tabernacle furniture. So it at least comes from the tabernacle. As far as is there any predecessors to that, well, that's sort of speculative at this point. We don't have enough iconographic evidence to sort of say what is the origins of the candelabra. Okay, but it does seem to originate with the tabernacle. And the book of Exodus does give instructions on how to build the candelabra. So there is that. Now, the Urim and the Thummim are very interesting, and I'm gonna sort of defer to Michael Heiser here for a change, because I think his view on this is actually quite interesting and quite profound. One of the suggestions he made was that now, if you've ever played Dungeons and Dragons, you'll know that the game comes with a set of what's called dragon dice. These are essentially multi-sided dice. So these aren't your ordinary 6-sided dice. They can have 10 sides. They can have 20 sides. This isn't new with D&D. Ancient people have been making 20-sided dice going all the way back to, say, the 3rd and 4th centuries BC in Egypt. Okay, so it's really, really clear that ancient peoples had these kind of dice. So one of the suggestions that Heiser came up with was that the Urim and the Thummim are plural, so there might have been 3 of these dice. Each side of the dice contained a letter. Okay, now if you know anything about ancient Hebrew, all verbs, all nouns have what's called a triconsonantal group, a triconsonantal root. Okay, so you can construct a word out of the 3 letters, provided you know what, say, the first letter is. That would be the Urim. So essentially, it's a roll of the dice that produces a word in Hebrew. So it's a very interesting theory, and it's a theory that I think has some really good merit to it, because we do have examples of 20-sided dice from ancient times that have a letter of the alphabet on each side of the dice. And 20 is just enough to cover most of the Hebrew alphabet. And there's some letters that can, double up here too. So, with 3 20-sided dice, you can come up with practically every serious, word in Hebrew. So, this is I think this is one of those theories by Heiser that really has legs. I think this idea really has legs. So this is where I would stand on this at the moment. So because you do have oracles in say, when Saul is searching for a message from God, and he's going to the Urim and the Thummim, and he's having to keep rolling the dice because he's getting nonsense. He's not getting a message. Well, in order to get a message out of dice, it has to actually communicate something more than yes or no. So I think it's very, very interesting that sometimes the Urim and the Thummim give you a yes and no answer. Sometimes it gives you a much more complex answer. That's only something that's possible with more complex kinds of dice, which I think the Urim and Thummim are, in all practical terms, a kind of dice to use for divination from the Lord. So that's my theory here, and it's, as I said, it's one I share with Michael Heiser on this. So thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. It's an interesting question. Okay. Okay, another $5 super chat from Michael Harrell. Thank you very much. Since the cherubim and seraphim are connected to the gods of ancient Egypt, what are we being told theologically about Yahweh? Well, we're told a lot of things theologically about Yahweh through this. First of all, we're being told that Yahweh is holy. Okay, because these are not major gods; these are minor gods. These are angelic beings. These are not gods on the same level as Yahweh. This is not a statement of polytheism. Okay, this is a statement of that there's one God and everyone else bows to him. Okay, and we see this even in Egypt in their own symbolism. Okay, so this is not something that's inferring anything pagan. What it's doing is it's inferring something very monotheistic, using the symbolism and the constructs of the late Bronze Age. Okay, it's also telling us too that, because, God, Yahweh, has no idol. So even as he uses these constructs and these images, he's using it in a way that's very distinct, very different. Okay, so think of it this way. You've got this Ark of the Covenant that's similar to a sacred bark or a palanquin throne. Okay, and in Egypt, you would have an idol or a person sit in that place between the cherubim. Well, what does it say when you have a sacred bark or sacred throne or the Ark of the Covenant and there's no idol there, but the presence of God is there? Well, without an idol there, human beings can't take care of that God. You can't put that God to bed. You can't clothe it. You can't feed it. You can't do anything for that God. That God is always awake. He never sleeps. He doesn't need feeding. He doesn't need care by human hands. And he's always on the throne. That's what it tells us theologically about God. That God is the master of the universe. God is in control. Unlike these other pagan gods who are not always in control because they have got to go to sleep at night because Amun-Ra needs his rest. Okay? But Yahweh doesn't. He doesn't have human needs. Heaven is his throne. The earth is his footstool. Okay? That's what this tells us about him. So it's giving us a really monotheistic, really theologically that God is the be-all and the end-all of all matters of faith. So this is what it tells us. So you don't have to worry about the symbolism inferring anything pagan. The symbolism is redeemed. It's redeemed to communicate Yahweh worship. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay, that's the end of the super chats. We'll get back to regular questions again. All right, I'll take this one from Tribal Chief. How do you interpret God hardening Pharaoh's heart in an Egyptian context? Did God take away his free will? Is there any place we can go to for further reading? Okay. This has been covered by a number of scholars. What we see in the progression of Exodus is and through the plagues, is that Pharaoh hardens his own heart. Well, we see the reflexive, what's called the Nifal tense being used often here, at least at the beginning of the narrative. Okay, that reflexive is, Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Then Pharaoh hardened his own heart. And God said, okay, you're going to go there? Fine. I'll harden it for you. You want to continue down that road? That's where it leads. So we do have to understand that with free will, there does come a point of no return. Pharaoh made the choice early on. And because he made that choice early on, God said, yeah, you're gonna stick by that choice? Okay, we'll keep you going down that road. So we do have to understand that what God's doing here is he's not taking away Pharaoh's free will. He is respecting the free will of Pharaoh in his previous decisions. Okay? So as a deity that respects his previous decisions, he says, okay, yeah, you did this to yourself. This is the path you chose. So that's how we can see that progression of Pharaoh from basically, okay, he's making the decisions on his own, to he's now being used for a greater purpose because he made those decisions. Okay, it's not in spite of his free will. It is because of his free will that Pharaoh has his heart hardened. Okay, so I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the question. Very much appreciate that. Okay, Matthew Harrell, $2 super chat. Thank you very much. Who were the Nephilim and the Rephaim? Okay, not really up on my Rephaim, so I'm going to defer that. I need to study that more. The Nephilim's a little different, okay? The Nephilim are... I think it comes from a root word meaning to fall. The fallen ones, okay? Now, who are the Nephilim? They are connected to what's called the sons of God. Okay. Now, in this particular case, I don't think, this is where I'm going to disagree with Heiser. I don't think the sons of God here were, say, the divine council. I think what we have here is a very, very human institution, essentially a fallen priesthood. Now, what do I mean by that? You look at, say, Mesopotamian texts. It talks about the sons of Ishtar. Okay, well, who are the sons of Ishtar? Well, that's a special class of priests. What do we talk? We even see this reference, for example, the kings of Egypt, who is the high priest of all Egypt, is called the son of Re. Okay, so priests in the ancient world are often called sons according to whatever deity they worshipped. So it's sort of an alternate term for priest. But you also have what are called naditum in the ancient Near East too. Now, a naditum is a priestess that takes a special sexual vow, a vow of abstinence, so she can serve the god or goddess. Now, what happens sometimes is people who take the naditum vow sometimes break it. And under these conditions, a child is born. And that's considered to be a bad omen. That's considered to be a bad sign when a child is born from a naditum breaking that vow. The most famous example of this is we mentioned him earlier, Sargon of Akkad. He was the child of a Niditum priestess who broke her vow. The result of the birth of Sargon Akkad leads to the overthrow of many kingdoms. So it was considered to be a really, really bad sign when these children were birthed. Okay, so I think the Nephilim are essentially the children of an entire class of priests and priestesses who'd taken these Naditum vows that ended up breaking them. So I think that is the best explanation for who are the Nephilim. Okay, now as I said, the Rephaim I need to look up and do a little more research before I say anything definitive there. But I hope that answers at least part of your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, we have got a $20 super chat from SlamRN. Thank you very much. Hey, it's good to see you. It's nice to have you here on the channel. Okay. Has Jeremiah 19:6, therefore, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when this place will no longer be called Tophet or Valley of Ben Hinnom, but rather the Valley of Slaughter. Has been fulfilled yet, or is Gehenna hell? Okay. Now, Gehenna is one of those interesting... I'm just going to flip to my version of this on my Bible software here, so at least I'm hoping on the same page. So just give me a moment here. So Jeremiah 19:6. Okay. So the context is looking at, if I look at the entire context here of Genesis 19, you know, the prophet is told to go to the Valley of Ben Hinnom, and you know, where they are performing burnt sacrifices to Baal and human sacrifices too. Okay, because a Tophet is child sacrifice. Okay, a Tophet is where, you know, a child is essentially ritually killed and burned. So that's what happened in the Hinnom Valley. Is there was a Tophet there, and there was human sacrifice. Okay, so the idea that it would be no longer called Tophet or the Valley of Ben Hinnom, rather the Valley of Slaughter. The Haragah is the Hebrew word for slaughter. It's hard to know if that had been in the intertestamental period when they said that. So the question of I don't think this is directly a reference to hell. Okay. Now there is a places in the biblical text are often idealized to have greater significance. We see this, for example, in Babylon. You know, for example, you know, Babylon is destroyed and made desolate, and we're told in the Old Testament that it would be inhabited no more. And yet we see in the book of Revelation, you know, the city of Babylon the Great. Okay, so we understand that that reference in Revelation is an idealization that has the characteristics of Babylon, but isn't Babylon per se. Okay, the Gehenna, which is a hell. I know hell is a Latin term meaning suffering. Gehenna is the is actually in reference to the Valley of Hinnom. And after it was used as a Tophet, it was used as a garbage dump. Okay, it smelled. Garbage was burned there. You know, prisoners were buried there. You know, because no self-respecting cemetery would take a prisoner. So we find people who were crucified. Actually, one of the best evidences we have for crucifixion is a piece of an ankle bone with a nail driven through it that was found in the Hinnon Valley. So I think this verse is actually talking about the real Hinnon Valley here, because there was a Tophet there. And again, child sacrifice was what was going on there. So you could have a secondary reading of this text, though, to infer that it's a hell-like entity, but I don't think this text is specifically talking about the idealization yet. We will find that later on, however, in, say, the New Testament. The New Testament will idealize this and make it a reference to hell, or the lake of fire. But at this point in time, in Jeremiah 19 here, it's just talking about the physical place, that valley that's right beside Jerusalem. So thank you very much for that super chat. Wonderful super chat. Very generous. Thank you very much. I hope that answered your question. Okay. We've got another super chat from Matthew Harrell for $5. Thank you very much. Why are some cherubim in Ezekiel and Revelation described as having 3 animal heads, 1 human head, and where do the Ophanim come from? Okay. I'm going to have to admit ignorance to the Ophanim. I'll have to look that up. I think that's a reference to snake deities, but I'm not quite sure. But the animal heads and the human heads, again, these are spiritual beings. These are spiritual beings, but they are claimed to have animal-like qualities. Okay. Sometimes they'll be portrayed as having lion features, sometimes lamb features, sometimes eagle features. There are many different descriptions for the cherubim, and they are not always the same. Okay. Like, for example, one of the things we find is when you look at the 4 horsemen in the book of Revelation, well, that refers to an Old Testament reference. And that Old Testament reference is clearly to angelic figures on these horses. Okay? They are kind of angels in that respect, as in being messengers. So we do see this, these different descriptions being applied, but they're not static. You're not to take away from this that they are actually look like animals in that respect. They're not actually supposed to be physical beings. They're not physical beings. They're spirits. But they are spirits that are being described in natural ways, because we're natural. We're corporeal beings. So because we're corporeal beings, in order for us to identify with what these other beings are like, the biblical writer is using analogical language. They're using an analogy to try to communicate something about these. The idea that they have 3 heads, they're constantly changing form. They have 6 wings showing the splendor and the glory. 2 wings to cover the face, 2 wings to fly with, 2 wings to cover their feet. Well, that's communicating, eyes that cannot look upon the glory of God, even for them. Wings that support them, and wings to cover their feet. And that's actually a really important symbol in the ancient Near East, because if in the ancient Near East you covered your feet to cover your shame, and it's still true today. It is still true today that if you are in the Middle East and you cross your legs. I mean, Westerners cross their legs all the time, and you expose your bottom of your foot to somebody, that's a deep insult. In fact, I was in the Cairo airport waiting for my flight. I was sitting there with my legs crossed. And this old guy with 2 wives comes and sits down right beside me. And he starts chewing me out for having my my foot exposed to him. So, you know, real traditional Muslim type. So that covering of the feet is very, very important. In fact, on my tour in Egypt, in January, we were at the garbage city, which has now been basically turned from a slum to a Christian enclave inside of Cairo, which is a fabulous story all of its own. It's just an incredible tale of redemption of an entire basically district that was sort of cast off. There's a saint there, a patron saint who is said to gouge out his own eyes, because a woman had come in. He was a shoemaker, and the woman had exposed her dress up to, but not including the knee. And one of the interesting things was on the tour was he's like, you know, I don't get this. I don't understand this. Why would he gouge out his eye just for exposing up to the knee? Well, culturally, that's the equivalent of going all the way. So there is actually a very, very significant, you know, cultural reference here by the covering of the feet. Okay, so I hope that explains some of this symbolism. Thank you very much for the super chat and the question. Very much appreciated. Okay. So that's it for the super chats again. Let's go back to ordinary questions. Oh, okay, it's the wheels with eyes. Okay. So, yeah, again, that does seem to be... Now, the Orpheum, the Ophanim, the wheels with eyes, thank you for pointing that out. That is... It's hard to say whether that's an angelic being or just part of the throne. Okay? Now, one of the things about that vision in Ezekiel is it's God's portable throne. So God is actually coming to the prophet instead of the prophet going to them. And this is an example of God's relationship becoming more and more distant to mankind. Now, early on in the days of the prophets, the prophet was actually lifted up into the throne room of God himself. But as Israel became more and more sinful over time, mankind couldn't be brought back up there. So eventually what happened was God came to them. And then finally we get to the revelation of Daniel, and God doesn't show up to the prophets anymore. He just sends messengers and angels. Okay? So part of that what we're being shown here in the Ezekiel revelation with the wheels with eyes is the throne of God. Okay, now you see this imagery of the throne of God of the throne, portal throne, in some Mesopotamian inscriptions, and it's essentially a throne on a platform with 4 wheels. Okay, and these wheels could move the throne about. Okay, so it's kind of like a wagon on which the throne of the king was sat. So the wheels with eyes here you are supposed to get that impression here that this is God's portable throne. Okay, so thank you for explaining what that was, because that opens things up. That makes it clear. Sorry. So, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate that. And the clarification. Okay. Matthew Harrell again for $5. Thank you. Will you please speak about the priestly garments in Leviticus? Does it come from somewhere? That's a good question. Some of it does, some of it doesn't. The kilt, practically every priest in the ancient Near East had a kilt. Okay. So, the ephod, absolutely. The ephod, the breastplate, also very indicative of common ancient Near Eastern religion. And that's, you know, sash also, very common. Now, the turban is not something you find ubiquitous. We don't know where the turban originates from as far as ancient Near Eastern cultures. The idea of the breastplate having 12 stones does not have, say, antecedent, at least as far as we can tell. Almost none of it, except for, say, the linen aspect, seems to be... It doesn't... The priestly garments don't seem to be that inspired from Egyptian sources. So they're getting this from somewhere else if they are borrowing it from, say, other religious contexts. But I'm suspecting here that there's more involved than just, say, ancient Near Eastern borrowing here. I think they are trying to communicate something new here with a lot of the high priestly garments. So I don't see a lot of ancient Near Eastern analogs to the high priestly garments, but that's not saying we won't find any in the future either. So, but it doesn't seem to come from Egypt. That seems to be clear. So they seem to be getting it from something else. Now, there is a possibility. The antecedent could have been what was being used at, say, the Temple of Baal. Now, the Temple of Baal was probably the most influential religious influence the early Israelites actually had. The Temple of Baal had been at Avaris since roughly the 11th dynasty. And it had been there almost the entire time that the Israelites were in Egypt. So it was the largest temple at Avaris. It was the most important temple at Avaris. So the practices there, and those practices, a lot of them came from a Levantine context. So knowing that, there is a possibility that the priestly garments might have been something that had come into Israelite culture analogously through what they knew at Avaris, through the rituals of the Temple of Baal. We can't say for sure. We don't have much inscriptions from that temple. We know a little bit about that temple. We do know it was something that the Hyksos imported with them. We do know that was the temple par excellence there. It was basically the center of the Asiatic population at Avaris. So it was incredibly important to them. And the Egyptians themselves had sort of a on again, off again sort of admiration for Baal. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. JD Freeze for $10. Hey, good to see ya. Glad you made it. Hebrew Greek sometimes use the same words for both breath, wind, and various spirits. Yes, they do. For example, in Hebrew, you get ruach, which means both breath and spirit. Same with the Greek. The Greek also does the same thing here. Did Egyptian A&E language also connect these concepts? And if so, does the metaphor extend to human spirits? No, it's not quite the same in Egyptian. There is a little bit of that. It is thought that in Egyptian, one does breathe. When breathes in, you are breathing in spirit and exhaling spirit. So there is that metaphor. However, that metaphor does not extend to, say, the soul or the human spirit, the one that's part of you personally. Okay, so to give you sort of the contrast here, in Hebrew and Greek, the concept of the spirit and the breath are one and the same. They're one and the same. God breathes the breath of life in him and makes him a spirit, a human being. Okay, so that breath of God is the same as the spirit of man. Okay, so you do have that one-to-one correspondence. Egyptian is different in this way. The Egyptian concept of humanity, you breathe in the spirit and you breathe out the spirit, but it's not that part of you. Okay, the spirit of man is divided into two portions, the ka and the ba. And the ka and the ba are they are spirits, but they're also independent of the breath. So with that said, there's the metaphor is there. It's just not the same connotations and not quite the same implications. So we have to kind of understand that there's limits to how far we can take some of these parallels. There is a parallel. It's just not exactly the same. So, but at the same time too, it's again part of that common ancient Near Eastern, common understanding. It's a common understanding that there is a connection between the breath and the spirit, even though it's not exactly the same. So anyway, thank you for that super chat. Great to see you. All right. We've got Sean Horton here with a $20 super chat. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Very generous. Okay. Why would the copiers of the Old Testament have left numbers as they were? For example, age of the patriarchs, numbers of people leaving Egypt, even as the cultural context required to understand what they meant became further away in time? That's a very good question. There comes a point where one doesn't dicker with the text. Okay? And I think what we're dealing with here is the fact that, even though later writers did understand, and it didn't take very long for whatever reasons they had for having those numbers. Okay? We don't understand completely the context of those numbers. And there are lots of good scholars right now that are doing research on this. It's a very, very difficult problem. Because we have to understand when we're looking at this through our lens, it's not the same as their lens. We're looking at this through not just science and engineering now, but accounting. How much of our world today has been shaped by accounting? We don't even think about this. We think of us as a technological society, as an engineering society. But we're also an accounting society. The 20th century is essentially built on accounting. Businesses, corporations, books, budgets, bank accounts, all these little things that require precision and numbers are part of our world. We are deeply deeply influenced by accounting. Ancient world, not so much. You know, the ancient world wasn't as concerned with precision. You know, we see this, when we look at, say, archaeoastronomy, where they're making measurements of the cycles of the moon or the rising of the star Sirius. If they were off by some days, they didn't care. That was just, close enough. You know, that's the way they thought, that close enough was good enough. You know, so we have to understand that, when they start using numbers in a specific way, they might be using it as an idiomatic expression. And if they're using it as an idiomatic expression, then it is subject to changes of the language and culture. And we do understand that, by the intertestamental period, a lot of even Hebrew scribes started realizing that some of these numbers weren't translating well to the idioms of their day. So they're left with a question then. Do they change that text? Do they update that text? Or do they just leave it as it is? And I think in most cases, they just left it as it is. We see this not just happen with numbers, but with place names. There are places in the Old Testament that by the intertestamental period have completely disappeared. Some of them didn't even make it to, say, the Babylonian exile. Like, for example, the city of Ramses. City of Ramses had been completely abandoned and disappeared and, completely, more or less wiped off the map as all that stone was recycled to build Tanis. That city didn't exist anymore. Well, what were their options for, say, the book of Exodus? Or in Numbers? Do they go back and change that reference to Ramses? Do they replace it with, say what's its next closest, which is Tanis? Do they put in a scribal gloss? Because that was an option too. Ramses now called Tanis. Not the same, but so it's very, very clear that even though the cultural context changed, there was a certain respect for the original text that sort of inhibited them changing it. Now, that's not to say that they didn't sometimes change it. Like, for example, that there are times, like, for example, like with the numbers of the generations, that they were sometimes changed to try to make sense of it, because they figured the math didn't work or it had implications that they didn't like. So there was those times when they did change numbers for specific reasons. Again, but that too carried its own problems, which is now they're using the context of their time, which again, now you're having to read the context of say the late Bronze Age, and then you're having to figure out the context of the intertestamental period, and then try to compare it to our own context, and it doesn't help us much anymore. But in fact, it makes things more complicated. But this is why I also think that it's great that we have, say, nowadays, that we have multiple text types that have been discovered that we can use to figure out, in many cases, what is what the autographs would have originally said. So I think they were concerned about this. I think they did see this as a concern. But I also think too that what could they do about it anyway? So anyway, I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay. Matthew Harrell for another $5. Thank you again. Do you know any books about Arabian polytheism? I can't find any. What do you recommend? I understand Amoritic. I can't find any. And what do you recommend I read to understand Amoritic beliefs. Okay. Well, that's a tough one. In both cases, I know there are some Arabian specialists that have worked a bit in this field. What you do need to do, there's to sort of trace down something on Arabian polytheism, what you're going to have to do is look at, say, books that talk about Old Arabic, the Old Arabic countries, like Sabah, Hadramut, those nations in the Arabian Peninsula, all the pre-Islamic stuff. You will probably it'll overlap with the Byzantine Empire at the time as well, because the polytheism of the Arabian Peninsula is it's both there, but it's also overstated by, say, more Islamic scholars as well. One of the things that, we have to understand that, while Arabian Peninsula had its own form of polytheism, that polytheism morphed over time. It changed over time like it does everywhere. Like during the Byzantine Empire, there was a lot more, say, Hellenistic and Roman gods being worshipped at the time. We find, say, remains of statues to Jupiter. We also find, too, though, that there's also Christian basilicas there. As Islam is getting its foothill in the 7th century, it's supplanting not just paganism, but also Christianity. So you're going to have to look at that old the books on Old Arabic history and language to get more of an idea of what it was like back then. I do know there are some books and conferences that have been published on this. It's not my specialty per se, so I can't really guide you on that one. My mentor Kenneth Kitchen could have answered this question immediately, because he's an expert on this. But unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that. Now, Amoritic beliefs, again, there hasn't been a lot published on this because we don't actually have a lot of texts. I think there was a book called The Amorites that was done a few years ago, but I can't give you the author or the publication date on this. So, a lot of what we know about, say, Amorite beliefs comes essentially from Babylonian texts. So the Babylonians will often talk about the Amorites, especially in dynasties, Babylonian Dynasty 2. So 1 and 2 are both sort of, they have that overlap with Amoritic culture and beliefs. So you will find stuff from Assyriologists that talk about this, and I believe there is a book written on this, but I can't name it. So thank you very much for the super chat, very much appreciated. It is a little out of my field though, so okay. All right, Tom Wanchik for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. I've read Sumerians had lineages going back 240,000 years and Babylonians 400,000 years. Do you think this indicates that humans really existed that far back? No, I don't. This is where things get complicated. It is true that they did have lineages of kings lists that went back that far. But if you look at how they tabulated those king lists, you notice something very, very interesting. Let me pull up my reference here. one of, say, the issues we have with the Sumerian and Babylonian kings lists is it's how it does chronology. Now, I'm not saying they did chronology. Chronology was not invented as a discipline until around the 16th century AD. But how they put together kings lists and how they tabulated kings list is very, very important for our understanding of this. One of the things we need to understand when we talk about Sumerian kings list is and the Babylonian kings list is that they did not, the Mesopotamians did not invent the concept of a year, a solar year. And I don't mean invent as in they invented it, but they discovered the year, solar year, okay, as a timekeeping metric. They didn't discover this until around, I'd say, the second dynasty of Uruk. Okay, that's when you start finding it, and that's going to be around 2400, 2300 BC. Okay, up until that point, the Mesopotamians are using a different method for tabulating the years of kings. So what you see is something very strange when you look at those kings lists. Like they'll say like a king reigned 28,000 years, but it's not going to give you exact numbers. It's going to be 28,000 years, and it's rounded to 28,000. And several kings have reigned in that list at 28,000 years. Then you'll see some that reigned for 14,000 years. And then you see some that reigned for less than that, but still over big numbers. Okay? So what we have here is, I think we have is another sort of idiom. An idiom being used to express the reigns of these kings. I don't think they actually reigned for that length. Okay. Some of what indicates that they didn't actually reign that length is the fact that they're using round numbers here. Okay. And round numbers are incredibly imprecise if you see a sequence of kings that reigned 28,000 years. Okay, you kind of get the idea that this is not an exact record. This is a idiom meant to infer a certain meaning, as in this king reigned a very, very long time. But because they hadn't invented the solar or discovered the solar year yet, they're at the loss to give you an exact tabulation. So I think that's what's going on in those king lists. And we also see this too. It's not only in their king lists we see this. We also see this in, say, the Egyptian king lists. You know, the earliest king lists, the kings that are mentioned in the Egyptian king lists are ascribed to gods. You know, Re, Seth, Horus. They're all ascribed, you know, these reign lengths that are like 50,000 years, or 25,000 years, or 5,000 years. Well, it's clear that, you know, those, even if we could say that those gods were actually living men that did reign, that they reigned for that length. Now, the Egyptians are a little different here because they discover the solar year much earlier than the Mesopotamians. You know, at least 5 to, say, 800 years before the Mesopotamians. So the Egyptians are already using regnal years well before the Mesopotamians are. So you see that sort of sanity come into, say, Egyptian kings lists much earlier than you do in the Mesopotamian ones. So I don't think they lived that long. I don't think they existed that far back. But I also think, too, that there's more going on here than meets the eye. So, especially when you're talking again, 28,000 years, yeah, there's an idiom in play here. So anyway, thank you for the super chat, and I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much. Okay, Gizmo SBOL for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. Could the Tempest Stela refer to the Thera explosion? Possible. It's possible. Now, the Tempest Stela is a Stela that dates to the Second Intermediate Period. It does talk about some freak weather events and a famine. The tricky bit here is going to be the Thera explosion itself. The Thera eruption has been proven to be very, very difficult to date. Very, very difficult to date. Scientists go back and forth all the time on when Thera actually erupted. We think it was sometime during Egypt's Second Intermediate Period. We can't exactly say when exactly during the Second Intermediate Period. We do know it had specific consequences. Like, for example, you can go to the Sinai today, and you can find pumice in the Sinai, on the Sinai coast by the Mediterranean, that's from Thera. Okay, so we do know that it had implications, that, you know, it had effects that reached Egypt. What those effects were exactly, don't know. When did they happen? Don't know. Could the Tempest Stela have referred to the Thera eruption? Maybe, but don't know. It's just, there's just so much here that we're still guessing about the Thera eruption. That hard to say one way or the other. Possible. Leave it at possible. So I thank you very much for that super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, Biblicotheca Historica for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Could you elaborate on your distaste for archaeoastronomy beyond just the fundamental concerns? Specific examples where you take issue. Oh boy. Oh boy. You want to get me on a rant, don't you? You really want to push that trigger button, huh? Okay. The fundamental problem, before we get into the specific examples, we'll get into the specific examples. But let's talk about the fundamental problem first, because the fundamental problem is actually the observer, the record itself. This is not a new problem, okay? When Joseph Scaliger did his chronology, and Ussher's chronology is based upon Scaliger's. Scaliger did all his fundamental proofs based upon Islamic lunar tables. You know, these are essentially observations of the moon that were recorded, and Scaliger used that to do his specific dating. Well, it was soon discovered that those records weren't accurate. That the observer had made specific mistakes. Mistakes off by a day or two here or there. Now, not a big deal normally, but if you're trying to calculate years based upon when the moon occurred in a certain month, yeah, that leads to years or decades of error. So that's one specific example of where, say, archaeoastronomy has led people astray. And we find these same sort of issues happening in Egyptian archaeoastronomy too. So it's not just the Islamic scholars that had this problem, it's also the Egyptians. In the case of lunar calendars, the lunar calendar was part of a religious observational calendar. That observation could vary depending upon, you know, how the priest looked up in the sky and said, well, this is that phase of the moon. Okay, so you did have that issue. In the case of the observation of the star Sirius, you know, there's several things that we are really unclear about of that observation. We know how long the cycle is now because we can calculate. We have a very, very precise idea how long a year is and how long this full cycle takes. You know, it's something like 1460 years. I think it's maybe 1463, but I'm not sure exact number. But we have a very precise number today. We don't know how long the Egyptians considered it to be. We don't know when the Egyptians considered the cycle to begin or end. We don't know how the observation of it was done. Was it done on a raised platform? Was it done on level ground? Was it done at the level of the Nile bank? Was it done on the top of a hill? That's going to change things. Okay. The observation just at sunrise, you know, air pressure, atmospheric effects can change the reading by plus or minus 4 days, which equals plus or minus 4 years if you're trying to date something by this. Then there's also the sort of the phony archaeoastronomy too. Like, for example, people trying to find alignments of the pyramids with the stars. Well, stars weren't aligned to the pyramids. They were aligned to the river. Okay? Now, the river happens to run north and south most of the way. But where the river bends, pyramids also bend with the river. So we got to keep that in mind too, that there's a lot of phony archaeoastronomy as well. Perhaps the best archaeoastronomy we have is the eclipses. Now, there's a couple of issues even with the eclipses. Not any old eclipse is suitable for archaeoastronomy purposes. Like, for example, there is eclipse has to be like 90%, 96%. Has to be have a 96% of the eclipse for people with the regular human eye to notice any difference. So you have to have pretty much an almost full eclipse for it to matter. The other thing is there's also times when eclipses are easier to observe, like when they're at high noon, as opposed to when they're on the horizon, because then you also get distorting effects there too. So the long and short of it is that just about every attempt to use archaeoastronomy for dating purposes has been a complete failure. It has not. And here's the thing. Archaeoastronomy has this veneer of being very, very scientific. It's based on astronomy, right? Astronomy works like Newtonian clockwork. Yeah, absolutely. You should be able to trace it back and find everything. It doesn't work that way in practice. So we have a difference here between what's theory and what's practice. And when we look at the theory and practice here, it's just not useful. It's just not useful as a dating technique. That's why I have that distaste, because I think a lot of people misuse it. Like, for example, like even the Sothic cycle. You know, the Sothic cycle in ancient Egypt wasn't used for dating purposes at all. We find it almost exclusively being referenced in medical texts, you know, like prescriptions. A priest would give somebody a prescription of medicine, basically take these herbs, and then do it on this particular day because of the rising of Sothis. Well, that's not a historical thing, that's a medical thing. So there was the belief that the rising of certain astronomical events affected medicine. So when we, as the 21st century, try to make heads or tails of this, we're not looking at the ambiguities of, say, medical practice. We are trying to view it as, say, Newtonian chronologists, and we're getting results that we don't understand, that don't make sense, because we're approaching it by asking the wrong questions. We're asking questions of these texts that they were never meant to ask. So, anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. Okay, JD Freeze, another one for 5 votes. Thanks, Dr. Falk. So, just so I'm clear, what was the nature of the spirit that was breathed in for the Egyptians? Okay. The nature of the spirit is life. Ankh. Okay, so that's sort of, they believe that the life was in the breath. Okay, but it isn't your mental faculties. Okay, it's not your cognition, and it's not your will. Those are different. Okay, it's what the breath is, what keeps you alive. To sort of draw a Hebrew parallel here, you know, we see in, say, the book of Genesis, the life is in the blood. So life is in the blood. Well, it's in the blood because the blood's carrying air to your cells to keep you alive. Okay. And the Egyptians believed that life was in the breath. So it wasn't in the blood, it was in the breath. So that's where the Egyptians sort of viewed the idea of the nature of breath. That was life. Now, the nature of spirit is different in ancient Egypt, because you had the Ba and the Ka. Okay? You had one where it was your will, it was your mental faculty, or sorry, one was your mental faculties, the other was your will. The Ka was your mental faculties, it was your memories, it was the stuff of your rational mind. The Ba was your will. It was your pure animal will. So when the Egyptians talk about the body dying and the spirit passing on, they're talking about the Ka and the Ba, not the breath that keeps you alive. So I hope that clarifies it. I hope that makes it clear what they believed. But I really appreciate the super chat, and I hope that clarification worked. So thank you very much. Okay, Kwame Adu 007 for $10. Thank you very much for that super chat. Hi, Dr. Falk. Is Genesis 13:10 evidence for an Exodus? Why would a Jewish author living in Babylon writing to fellow Jews have reference to an area in Egypt to describe a place in Israel? Well, let me look up that passage first. Let's talk about that. So, Genesis 13. Uh, 10. Okay. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of the Jordan, that it was watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go to Zoar. Yeah, I think that's a reference to the Exodus. You need a... Okay. Yeah, you can definitely all right. Yeah, Genesis 13:10 does seem to indicate that is a reference to the Exodus. Absolutely. You know, we have to remember that Genesis was compiled and written probably during the wandering in the wilderness, at least certain portion of it. So I think that it's very, very likely that what we have here is a reference to the Exodus. So yeah, I don't think this is talking about, I mean, the land of Egypt, Mitzrayim. The word is Mitzrayim. It's the dual. It's interesting when you look about Egypt. Egypt is in Semitic languages Mitzir. You know, if you look at, say, the official name for Egypt, even today, it's called the Arab Republic of Mitzir. Mitzir being the Arabic word or Semitic word for Egypt. Now, it's interesting that in the Hebrew, Egypt is in the dual. You know, you've got that upper and lower Egypt going on. So it's even interesting that when Hebrew scribes, writers talk about Egypt, they're always referring it in the dual, and that's a very interesting thing, because other places in, say, like in Babylon, it's also not in the dual. It's in the singular. It's Mitzir. So it's very interesting because that word Mitzir is ubiquitous. It's the name that's used of Egypt all across the ancient Near East, and it's ancient, really, really ancient. So it's definitely not talking about. I mean, even if you did say, you know, that this was you know, a Jewish author living in Babylon, it still would have to refer to Egypt, because this is just what they called Egypt. So I do think it is definitely a reference to the Exodus. I think it is doing it in the typical Jewish style of referencing Egypt, that Hebrew style of referencing Egypt. And it does not refer to a place in Israel. I mean, anyone who says that this is referring to a place in Israel, you know, doesn't know the basics of either biblical Hebrew or ancient history. So thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. And I hope that answered your question. Okay, RG Strategy for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Last time I asked who was your favorite king, but who is your least favorite? Also, congrats on becoming a GIF on Twitter and Discord. You are now immortalized. I'm a very, very serious scholar. Yeah. I'm a very, very serious scholar. But that was hysterical. I will admit that was funny. Okay. Yeah, I don't know how to take that being memed. This is now like the third time I've been memed. So it takes a little bit of an adjustment. I'll say that. Okay, who's my least favorite king? Oh. I'm gonna say my least favorite king is actually not a king. It's a queen. My least favorite ruler of Egypt has to probably be Hatshepsut. Okay. I know that's gonna sound like blasphemy to a lot of people, but She just strikes me as being just a scoundrel, an absolute opportunist, a scoundrel, a manipulator. Um, she's not a nice person. Yeah, not a nice person. So probably Hatshepsut is probably my least favorite ruler of Egypt. I know many people admire her, and they're welcome to their opinions on that. I won't fight them on that, but I also have my opinions too. And she always struck me as a usurper, as an illegitimate authority in Egypt. And she used the power of the court to essentially usurp the throne. So she's not my favorite. I can see the sort of the dirty trick squad she used to try to get rid of Tutmosis III. She just underestimated Tutmosis III's abilities, you know, and it's only because that Tutmosis III was charismatic, good at war, preferred to be away from Egypt, away from her influence, that he survived that whole thing. So I think essentially that Hatshepsut enlisted Tutmosis III into the army to essentially have him killed. Essentially, you know, get him in the army, send him off the war, get him killed on the battlefield. I think that was her plan. So you know, and she did that to him at a pretty early age. You know, she had him already out there, you know, before he was a teenager. So she really tried to axe him. Now, I don't think she had him tried to have him intentionally assassinated. I think she was just hoping that war would take its natural course and he would be done in. But that didn't happen. So I think she was one of the more unscrupulous rulers of Egypt. And there's basically a rogues gallery of those anyway. So anyway, that's my least favorite. Thank you very much for the super chat. Let's see here. Okay, we are at the end of the super chats here, so let's look at some more questions. We are, of course, getting at the near the end here of our hour and a half. So let's see if anybody I didn't take. If I'll take Charles Smith's question. Do you think that the tree in the Garden of Eden is related to Asherah? Or is it Mesopotamian? Neither. I think there's a very, very strong ancient Near Eastern symbolism for trees. We find this all through the ancient Near East. We find it in the Tale of Gilgamesh. You know, where, you know, the god, you know, blesses the olive branch with immortality. The snake eats it and becomes immortal. We also see this in, say, the Tree of Life. That's often used in, say, Egyptian symbolism. Like, for example, at Karnak Temple, there's a relief there of Seti I with his name being written on the leaves of the tree, again showing a type of immortality. So we do see these trees having certain references, you know, one tree being to immortality, one being to the knowledge, the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, you know. So there is plenty of mythological references in other religions that make reference to trees in the garden. So I don't think they're Asherah. In fact, what it appears like is Asherah are something completely different. My theory on the Asherah is it's actually most closely resembles the Osiris fetish. In fact, if you look at, say, the etymology of Asherah and Osiris is just Usur, you get at least two of the consonants that match. So there's a weak etymological link here between Asherah and Osiris. And Osiris was not portrayed, his sort of idol wasn't at least in the sacred barks. You know, we're not talking about the little votive idols that you find everywhere. We're talking in the sacred barks. The idol that was supposed to embody Osiris himself. That was not an idol. That was actually what's called the Osiris fetish. It's essentially a tree trunk. And if you look at the sacred bark of Osiris, it's very, very interesting. Because you get this sacred bark, and there's this tree trunk. It's sticking right out of the roof of the roof of the sacred bark with the top of the Osiris fetish. So I think what we have here with the Asherah is not a tree. What we have here is a carved tree trunk. A carved tree trunk that's meant to embody an idol, which is to be used as an idol. So I think that's what we have here in the way of the Asherah pole. And it's very, as I said, it's very analogous to what we find with the Osiris fetish. So I think they're one and the same. I think the two are so... It's so uncanny how similar they are that it would really surprise me if the Asherah was not somehow related to the Osiris cult. And it works chronologically too. So, you know, the Osiris cult gets its sort of its big start here in Egypt. You know, while it's an ancient cult, it really isn't until the beginning of the Middle Kingdom that the Osiris myth really takes off. So middle of Dynasty 11 is when it takes off, roughly around 2000 BC. And it's only shortly after that we start seeing Asherah being used in Levantine religion. So it's the circumstantial evidence there is very strong. It's a very strong circumstantial case. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for that question. Interesting question. Okay. I will take one or two more questions, and then I'm going to call it a night, because I think my voice is starting to give out on me. So... I am... Let's see here. Anything at the beginning? I'm going to go straight to the beginning here. Okay, I'm going to take Disciple of Christ question here. How common was it for generals like Horemheb to end up ruling Egypt? It wasn't that common, but it did happen. It happened on a few occasions. It happened during, say, the First Intermediate period, when the Thebans defeated the Heracleopolians. It happened at the end of Dynasty 18 with the succession crisis of the Theban royal line. So you had Horemheb, who was a general. You also had Ramses I, who was a general. We have to kind of understand that Egypt has always been a military dictatorship. Always been a military dictatorship. Even the pharaohs the kings of Egypt, they're military dictators. They are, almost every king at the beginning of his reign has to be a general too. You know, they go out, they have to go conquer the Levant, go break some skulls in Kush, and beat back those Libyans. So the first few years of every king's reign is usually marked by a series of campaigns where the king is actually leading his troops out on campaign. So there is that tradition, there is that martial tradition where every king has to be also a military ruler. He's not just a religious ruler, he's a military ruler. It's actually a rare exception when a new king to the throne doesn't go out on campaign. There are like a couple exceptions, like Amenhotep II, who was like 12 when he comes to the throne, you know, or not Amenhotep II, Tutmosis II, where he comes to the throne when he's 12 and he's just too young to go out on campaign. So, there's those exceptions, but they're rare. You see some more generals coming to the Egyptian throne at, say, at the end of Dynasty 30, you know, with the restoration, the temporary restoration of an Egyptian monarchy prior to it being, you know, defeated for the last time by the Persians, and then ultimately Greek rule. Now, Ptolemy the First was also a general, so there's another example of a general becoming an Egyptian king. So, it wasn't the norm, but it did happen. It did happen, and it happened more than once. So anyway, thank you very much for that question. Very interesting question. And I'll take one more, and then I'm going to call it a night here. So, okay, I'll take this one. This is an interesting question. I like this one here. Okay, from Brandon Oliver, and this will be the last question of the night. How do you balance your knowledge and spirituality? I struggle with approaching application to my life and balance I need. I also tend to lean too much on my own thoughts rather than on God. Okay. The balance of knowledge and spirituality, I think in many ways is in a sense of false dichotomy. I don't think you have to do one at the sacrifice of the other. I think it's a both proposition. You know, when we talk about knowing God, getting to know him better, it's about knowledge of God, you know, who he is, how he behaves, what he does. You know, it would be like for example, I love my wife. I adore my wife. But if I didn't know anything about my wife, it would not be a very deep relationship. Okay? If I didn't know what her favorite foods were, if I didn't know what her favorite activities were, if I didn't know what her favorite video games were, you know, I know an awful lot about my wife. And that has led to a deepening of my relationship with my wife. It isn't just the knowledge of my wife alone. It's knowledge that leads to acts that please her. Okay? That there's sort of a mutual understanding there. You know, in the same way, when we look at, say, knowledge of you know, a lot of people approach the Bible as, you know, maybe sterile study or approach spirituality as, say, something that's divorced from knowledge. I don't think you can do that and not have a meaningful relationship. If you want a meaningful relationship with God, you really, really do have to know as much as you can about God. And I think this is important. I mean, we look at, say, and I'm going to paraphrase James here, because I get this fairly frequently. Some people have come up to me and say, well, I have faith and you have knowledge, I'm implying I don't have faith. It's like, okay, then this is where I quote James, and I say, you say you have faith without knowledge. I will show you my faith by my knowledge or my scholarship. For me, there is no separation between faith and scholarship. Scholarship is a work. James is telling us that we show our faith by our works. I show my faith by my scholarship. For me, every act of scholarship is an act of worship. It's an act of worship. And because for me it is an act of worship, every bit of knowledge I accumulate, every discovery I make, is ultimately for the glory of God. And I guess that's why I don't struggle with this. Because there's a mindset there that says all of this has the purpose of bringing myself and others closer to God. This is why I put up with, a lot of the junk I have to do on the YouTube channel. Because frankly, on this YouTube channel, I do get a lot of abuse. I get a lot of hate mail. And it's a lot of hate mail from other Christians. Frankly, most of it is. But they don't seem to understand that the reason I do this is for their edification. It's for them to develop a deeper understanding of who is God. What is God trying to tell us? What is God trying to communicate that we can love him more and better? How can we understand that God's word is trustworthy? All of this knowledge is contributing to those questions. It's not knowledge of its own merit, but for its own sake. It's knowledge that helps us build our faith block by block. And this is why I also think too that we have to be careful too as that our knowledge is correct. So, this is getting to the second part of your question is, where, can we lean too much on our own understanding and our own thoughts, rather than God? Yeah, sure. Happens all the time. It is possible to lean too much on your own understanding. But we also have to understand too that everyone's understanding is going to be ultimately limited in some way. Everybody says, mine's limited. I don't know everything. This is where I have to be humble enough before the Word of God to let the Word of God teach me. I'm not doing this on my own. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. I am sitting beneath the Word of God. So I'm kind of in that sort of middle position where, the Word of God is above me. Scholars that preceded me are below me. In that I'm leveraging on them. And I am benefiting from the two combined. And I'm trying to always remain humble enough to say, I don't know. Because if I admit I don't know, then I am open to learning. And I'm always learning. And I'm always saying, going back to the Word of God and saying, okay, Lord, teach me. Teach me. If you have a teachable spirit, if you go to those wiser than you first, If you always say, I sit beneath the Word of God and the Word of God has supremacy, then the balance sort of works itself out. You just find the right balance because the Lord gives that to you. So anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you very much for the question. It's a great question. And with that, we are going to call it a night. Thank you for everyone who joined us tonight. I'm glad you turned out. It was great to have you on the channel here again in our 17th live stream. I very much appreciate everyone who donated a super chat tonight. Those super chats really help us sort of make ends meet to continue this ministry. And this is, for us, this is an academic ministry. You know, we don't use this very often. We don't talk about academics being a ministry, but it should be. It should be. Because it's taking the knowledge scholars and learned men acquire and sharing it for the building of the body of Christ. And that's why we're here. That's why we're doing this. So with that said, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for all our Patreon supporters. They really help us. Thank you very much for our regular subscribers. And I hope you have a great night. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.